Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Kathy Madison. I'm with Comtech and CIDM, and I'll be the moderator today. We're thrilled to have Mike from Precision Content with us. And before I turn it over to him, I just want to do a couple of intro slides, and then we'll do some logistics there at the end. So if you're not familiar, Comtech and CIDM are the same company. Some people don't realize that. Comtech is our consulting arm, and we have been providing consulting services since 1978, providing everything to help you make better content for your end users, whether that's helping you create a content strategy, developing a taxonomy, doing an information model, assessing your processes to see how you compare to other organizations out there. And of course, with all these things that we provide services, we also typically have training workshops on those as well. And that's on the Comtech side. And then on the CIDM side, that is our member organization. And it's also the organization that brings you webinars like this, and we put on conferences. We have membership levels, everything from bronze, which is the lowest individual level, all the way up to platinum for large enterprises. And of course, the benefits change depending on your level. So I'd be glad to talk to anybody about Comtech services or the CIDM organization. So that's a little bit about us. As I said, we are teaching workshops right now. They're all online. We have one starting tomorrow on taxonomy, which I think is probably an important role in Microcontent. I'm not sure. We'll learn here in the next hour. So that's why I highlighted that one. But certainly, like I said, we provide services on all sorts of things. So we've got some data classes as well as content strategy. And then, of course, our very popular minimalism class coming up in the fall. We also have a conference coming up in the fall called our Best Practices Conference, and that is geared for information development managers. We typically like to almost call it management therapy, where you get to meet with other managers and learn how to address issues that may come up in your organization and see how other managers have done that. So that's the Best Practices Conference. And we do have some webinars, still one more this month, one next week, and then early June. So we're going to hear from the folks from Fluid Topics, also from Simplified English. And then we're going to have a joint presentation with SDL, who's now RWS, along with one of their clients, NXP. So a little bit of a variety in our webinar series that we have coming up. And if you are not getting the emails about our webinars and our conferences and our workshops, we encourage you to go ahead and subscribe. You can stay informed that way. We do let you choose whether you only want to learn about events or if you want to get our newsletters. So you can do both of those or only get information about events. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So that's what I have, just as an intro. And before I turn it over to Mike, I do want to do some logistics. There is a chat box and a questions box in the Zoom interface. We prefer that you put your questions that we'll field at the end of Mike's presentation in the questions box. If you just have general comments, you want to say, agree with something he's saying or add to it, but it's not really a question, go ahead and use the chat for that. Mike thinks his presentation is going to be about an hour, and then we have a half hour for questions at the end. And so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Mike from Precision Content. He is the VP of Training and Content Services. So Mike, it's all yours. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kathy. I'm going to try and get this up and running. Let me know when you can see it. You can see it?
Yep, it looks good.
Perfect. So we're here to talk about writing for microcontent. So I won't be getting into taxonomy, so you're safe on that one, Kathy. Before we get into it, a very little bit about me. My name's Mike Rowlinson. As Kathy mentioned, VP of Training and Content Services at Precision Content. And I understand most of you are familiar with precision content. If not, essentially what we do is consulting, transformation, and training in the technical writing and technical communication space, technical content. I've been in the industry about 15 years, mainly in the training role, but also the writing role. So the two have gone hand in hand. And the reason I'm telling you a lot of this is my main responsibility is for evolving the content standard of precision content. So we do have a very robust content standard, and it's constantly evolving as we come across new situations, as we come across different kinds of information. And as we work with different clients, sometimes we need to, or often we need to modify for that client, but also sometimes there's things we can bring back to our own content standard and say, hey, that'd be a really good, a good way that now we've solved this problem. That'd be a really good thing to build into our overall content standard. So that's one of the things that that I'm responsible for. So let's get into micro content. So micro content isn't micro content just because it's small. So as you may or may not know, micro content, the term was coined by Jacob Nielsen in the early 90s and has evolved since then. So what is it about? Well, micro content is content that's about one primary idea, fact, or concept. It's easily scannable. It's labeled for clear identification and meaning, and it's appropriately written and formatted for use anywhere and at any time that it's needed. Excuse me. Like I mentioned, it's not just because it's small. And so this isn't quite as daunting as it sounds. We see examples of micro content everywhere. You could start with the title of a publication, and we're seeing in chatbots that the micro content is becoming extremely, I guess, ubiquitous is the word I was looking for. So when we think of micro content, think of it as building blocks of information, very precise, very concise, conforming blocks of content that we can use to serve up as micro content. But it's used to build any number of traditional types of documentation. This could be a knowledge base, could be PDFs, could be user guides, anything like that. So we're really talking about those building blocks. So we're going to look at these four main principles of intelligent micro content, and specifically how they tie into the writing, or more importantly, how writing is the foundation for these. Okay, so think about content that you feel matches these characteristics as you go through. So the methodology for writing micro content is to write content that answers questions, so that intelligent technology can answer those same questions. And you can change your existing content into micro content to adapt for these conversational user interfaces. So these are the principles: focus, function, structure, and context. And we're actually going to start just there. Gotcha, didn't I? We're going to start with context. We're not going to discuss very much about context, but we're going to use it to frame our conversation, to, I guess, give it context, if you like. So what is context? Well, the purpose of, or the point behind context is that micro content must be easily relatable to other content. So the micro content piece is a product of a more precise form of authoring. So that means we burst out content into small manageable pieces, as we'll see in a moment. So if you think about a book, you've got numerous levels of metadata. You'll have book level metadata, you have map level metadata, you have topic level metadata, and so on. One possible misconception about writing micro content is that we ask a question and then we author the content that answers that question. So we're not just writing small chunks of content in a vacuum. We still need to maintain a topic-based paradigm. So all the chunks need to work together. But what we're looking at writing, what we're looking at is writing information in a way that it can be burst into these standalone chunks, like that. So we write to produce microcontent from topics rather than writing microcontent to produce topics. And once written, we can reassemble that content in any number of ways. We could reassemble it as a manual, as knowledge base, user guide, and so on, or we could use each piece separately and appropriately through any number of channels, all based on this context, based on that metadata. That's all I'm going to say about context. So let's move on to focus. So when we're looking at microcontent, it must be about only one subject. Now, traditionally, we tend to pack as much information into as little real estate as we possibly can, but this has a negative effect on both technology and humans. And we can only use that information. We have to be able to use that information, we have to unpack it. Okay, and as humans, we can do this because we have things like visual cues. We're intelligent creatures. And we have things like headings, paragraphs, white space, stuff like that. Technology can't do the same thing. It can't quite unpack it in exactly the same way. So we have to unpack it for technology. And so we break it down by subject and information types. And we're going to see more about information types a little bit later. So I want to do an experiment with you. I'm going to show a number of words on the screen. There's 21, in fact. And I want you to see how many words you can memorize in 20 seconds. Now, here's the thing. Don't write them down while they're on the screen, because that's cheating. But if you'd like to write them down, what I'm going to ask you to do is write down as many as you can after they disappear from the screen. Okay, so 20 seconds. Ready? Here goes. Okay, take 30 seconds to jot down as many as you can. There we go. The duck tells us that's 30 seconds. So how many did you remember? Did any of you remember all 21? 10 to 20? 5 to 9? Fewer than 5? So commonly, people will remember between 5 and 9 items. Okay, and you'll remember this. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But what's the first thing that you did to remember those? Whether you knew it or not, this is all based on how the brain works. And whether you know it or not, your brain filtered out the noise. It said, okay, let's cut through the different fonts, the different colors, the different highlighters, and let's get rid of that noise and focus on the content. And so that one's the very first thing you did. So you probably end up with something like this. The next thing your brain did was break it into smaller groups. Now, the memory test shows you can only remember a certain number of items. But once you remove the noise, you can now get into memorizing those words. And so we have this principle. So that first principle was consistency, getting rid of all the noise. Chunking is the next principle. And with chunking, we're breaking content down into smaller groupings, into bite-sized pieces. And you're probably familiar, or you may be familiar with the research from Miller back in the 50s, and the 7 plus or minus 2 rule. And it's all about how much information you can remember, you can put into short-term memory. And so by breaking content down into parts, it can help us remember. So the next thing you do, you look at this screen and you say, but hang on, Mike, that's not easier to remember. All you've done is just move the words around. There's no categorization there. There's no rationale as to which word goes where. And you're absolutely right, because like I mentioned, this is how your brain works. Okay, so when we think about organizing words or breaking down words, we want to organize them by similarities, which brings us to our third principle, which is relevance. And when we apply relevance, now we've got some groupings that our brain looks at and go, ah, that makes sense to me. I want to receive this information like this. And the fourth principle is titling. So when we look at titling, what we want to do is classify and title each of those groups. So we title them, and we've already grouped them. So now we title them, and we can title them as sports or animals or countries. And when we put all that together, and we reproduce the content in a way that the brain wants to receive it, it might look something like this. So when I ask back to the to how well did you do, quite often I'll get a question on this. Mike, why did you put cricket in sports rather than animals? Once we've got over that bit, the answer, of course, is because I'm originally from England. Once we've got over that bit, we look at it and say, okay, let's see how many I remembered. And usually we'll look through and somebody in a group may have added one. And that's pretty common as well, because we're working along that thought of, oh, I remember this and this and this. Ooh, was there this one? I'll just write it down just in case. And so that happens with this exercise too. But once you take those out, my guess is chances are most of you scored somewhere remembered between 5 and 9 items. Some groups, there'll be people in the 10 to 20 group. In 15 years of running this exercise, I've only ever had one person who remembered all 21. And that was just, well, I was a bit surprised, to say the least. So if I'd have given you the information like this, how many more would you have remembered? Well, let's try it. So I'm going to show you, they're different words, so it's not going to be as easy as you thought, but I'm going to put the words back on the screen. Again, 21 words, and I'd like you to remember or see how many you can memorize in 20 seconds. Again, I'll give you 30 seconds to write down all that you can remember. Okay, ready? Here they come. Take 30 seconds to write down as many as you can remember, please. And the duck has quacked. So I'd like to hear from members of the group. What did you score? Did you score better in the second time, or did you score the same, or did you score fewer? Can we hear from a couple of people? Stunned silence. All right, I'm getting chat there. There we go. Forgotten entire category, right? Okay, and that's pretty common. So some scored the same, only added 2 more. Well, if you're adding 2 more to let's just say 10, that's 20% increase. Memorized mostly all of them the second round, great. Got a better score. Forgotten entire category. Yeah, that's again, that's not uncommon. We tend to focus on a category, go down the list, focus on another category, go down the list, and often can't even remember what that category was. Again, only improved by 2, not as many as I thought. Okay, still we're looking, 15% increase. I did better, 13 the first round, 16 the second, better, the scores were better. 12 the second time, 8 the first, 13 versus 9, 13, 6 better this time, wow. And somebody else forgot a category. Yeah, and so it goes to show that you're looking for specific information. So once you looked at an information, so what happened there was you went through the content and you looked for, say, capitals, like the capital cities or the cities, and you went through there and said, okay, so I remember London, I remember New York, I remember Sydney, and you're picking and choosing those cities from the list. Previously, you were having to pick them from all over the place. Then you started on maybe the farm animals. And so when you, as you look through that, you then go to farm animals, and then time kind of ran out. And so that's as far as you got. And so, which is why you couldn't even remember the third category. And that's highly likely. What's happened though is that your brain is, or the content has done the work for you in a lot of ways, in that you don't have to go that extra step to pull words out from all over the place and then put them together in a format like this, which is what your brain wants to see. I'm quite thrilled that nobody actually scored fewer, so that's kind of cool. At least nobody admitted to fewer. Oh, and Larry said scored 1 more the second time, and each time I added 1 that wasn't on the list. Okay, so we've got that assumption happening, which is, hey, this is a common sport, it must be in here, or oh, this is a really well-known city, so this one must be on the list, and that can be that power of assumption. The one thing I would argue or I would suggest on that is that even if we did make one up, how much easier is it to check in what we're seeing on the screen here compared with the previous version where the words were all over the place? It's going to be much quicker to check. So that's an experiment on some of the foundation of precision content and where we get started. So these are the 4 organizing functions, and we just saw them in action. So consistency, chunking, relevance, and titling. And that's done from the perspective of the user. As a user of information, that's what we do. We look for consistency, and we kind of filter out all that noise. And then we want content that's chunked by relevance and well titled. Now, as a writer, we apply them in a slightly different way. We chunk out the content, then we apply relevance, where we chunk out by relevance. Then we give it an appropriate title, and once we have that appropriate title, we just check through everything and make sure that it's all consistent. So here are the rules that, or some of the rules, guidelines that we follow. So when we're chunking, we aim for no more than 9 items in any context. So for example, no more than 9 items in a list, rows in a table, blocks in a topic, or topics in a map. And we could add any number of applications of the chunking principle to that. The relevance principle is simple in that if it's a separate relevance, we put it in a separate chunk. We put it wherever else it belongs. And if it's irrelevant, we delete it. So we could have redundant content in there. It could be irrelevant to the audience, and in that case, we get rid of it. Otherwise, we categorize it into its own section or mini section, block, chunk, whatever we're calling that. Titling. Our rule is very simple. We title everything. We title every block. We title every map. We title every table column. If you want to think of that, the top of the table column as a title. And so we give everything a name. And what that enables the user to do is to use those signposts to get to the point where they want to get to. And finally, consistency. And with consistency, we're talking about consistency of terminology. So rather than client or customer or whatever, we'll pick one. We'll just say, yeah, always a client. And pick the word that's the most appropriate. We have the same sequence of blocks. So when we have similar content, we'll have a similar sequence of blocks. So it might start with the definition and then a little bit more information about the definition and so on. And we'd use consistent styles. So we'd use the same font for the title. We'd use the same type of language. We'd use and the same look, the same if something were to be emphasized, we'd use that same way to emphasize anything else that needed to be emphasized of a similar type of content. So here's an application of the 4 organizing functions. And you'll see this one is all about chunking. And when we break it out into its component parts, you see there's actually 4 things in there. First of all, there's a definition of chunking, then there's a purpose of chunking, and then there's a chunking rule, and then there are chunking limits. And okay, so thank you. Rebecca just noted that given this is Global Accessibility Awareness Week, just to note that a lot of these organizing functions are just good, accessible, inclusive, and or universal design principles. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, bang on. So by breaking them out into the component parts, we can see there's these 4 different sections, and we now say, okay, so what questions are we asking? So why are they different parts? Well, each part's answering a different question. When we see the original content, we're really answering 4 questions. What is chunking? What's the purpose of chunking? What are the chunking rules and what are the chunking limits? And when we see the final transformed version, we can see that each chunk answers one specific question. So what that does is it enables us to use this as micro content. We've written it as part of a topic, but we've broken it down in a way that it can now be reused either elsewhere as a topic, or we can reuse each of those blocks as in a micro content context. So we can publish each one separately. That could appear as the answer in a chat, could appear somewhere in an email, could appear in a PowerPoint presentation, and so on. So let's have a look at the next item, which is function. And so when we look at when we talk about function, we say that for microcontent must be categorized to identify the user intent. And I mentioned information types a few minutes ago. You may be most familiar with them, most commonly perhaps with DITA, Darwin Information Typing Architecture. And so that's probably the most widely used structured authoring model. When we look at the information types that we have at Precision Content, we'll see that rather than the reference, task, and concept that you see it through DITA, we have a couple more. Before we get there, let's just talk about why information types are important. So they inform the writing style. And so when we think about information types, an information type is a classification of information based on a purpose and intended response of the user. And so it's based on the function of that content. When we look at the information type, it can help us help inform how topics and blocks are titled. We have a title structure for each different information type. It can inform the construction of that block and or topic. Can inform the writing style. And so when we talk about voice and tense, so for example, if I want to give you an instruction, I'll give it to you as second person in the imperative. Second person active voice present tense, do this, do that, do the other. If I'm simply describing what happens for somebody else, it could be third person active voice present tense. He does this, she does that, they do the other. Specific writing structures, and I'll show you the writing structures that we use at Precision Content in just a moment. And be rules for short descriptions, and not just short descriptions, but a lot of the other specific blocks as well. So there'd also be the structure of the topic structure, as well as how we write each particular piece of that structure. So information types are the foundation to essentially everything we do. And often when we go through content, one of the ways that we'll break it out is if all we do is identify the information types. Very often that's going to give us a great start in chunking content. So the two do go hand in hand. Oops. So I want to just talk very briefly about the guiding principles. So we have 3 guiding principles of Precision Content, and they drive a couple of things. First of all, they drive the overall deliverable of what we're trying to do with a particular deliverable. So when we first write the content, we identify, first of all, who our audience is. So who are we writing for? What's the purpose of this content, and what's the intended user response for this content? So we've written it, great. What do we want our audience to do with it? Because that's going to inform at the high level, at the document level, it's going to inform what goes into that document. And I use the word document very broadly. What goes into that particular deliverable, what stays out of that deliverable, and the way, so maybe the tone and the scope of the content within there. So and overall the way that we're going to write it, the focus of that document. Now, when we get to the information types, we do the same thing. We check the audience, we identify the purpose of this particular piece of content, and we identify the intended user response. So what do we want the user to do with this particular piece of content? That informs the information type and also how we write it. So really a fundamental part of everything that we do is getting into those guiding principles. So let's have a look at the Precision Content information types. The first is reference, and with reference, it states things that the reader needs to know. It's that simple. So it could be a statistic, it could be a purpose that we just saw, the purpose of chunking. It could be some facts about something, some general data. The room I'm standing in is 4 meters by 3 meters, or whatever that is, 12 feet by 9. Principle information advises the reader about what they need to do or not do and when. And when we talk about principal information, these are the rules, the guidelines, the policies that dictate what we must or mustn't do, or should or shouldn't do. They're guiding human behavior effectively. So you'll find things like you do not walk on the grass, or keep on the sidewalk. 2 ways of saying the same thing, perhaps. A lot of, when we're driving, we see an awful lot of principal information. We see a lot of rules, things like speed limits, no entry signs, one way. They're all guiding or requiring our behavior. And we can tell how guided or required it is by the fine that we get when we fail to observe those. Concept. When we talk about concept, Precision Content, we use concept in a very specific way, and that's to explain things the reader needs to understand. And often people who are familiar with DITA have trouble with differentiating between reference and concept, because quite often in data they'll use reference purely for just pure data. So here are the numbers from this, and here are the specs for that. So in reference, we use reference a little more broadly, but then we have a much tighter view of concept. And really, concept is all about learning something new. So it's usually a term or an idea that needs defining, and then differentiating that term or idea from something else that's similar and could be confused with it. Process. So when we look at process, we're demonstrating to the reader how things work or what happens. So we're looking at within a system, and it could be either a human system or a non-human system. And when we look at a human system, it could be things like how CIDM puts on webinars. And so person A does this, person B does that, person C does that, etc., etc. When we look at a systems type process, it's usually how something works. And so very specifically, so how internal combustion engines work, for example, or how diesel engines work. And so it'd be saying, this part does this, that part does that, this part sucks in air and diesel, and that part makes it explode, and all the rest of it. So that would be more of a systems process. And finally, task. And when we look at task, this is pretty much a one-to-one correlation between data and precision content, in that task is all about instructing the reader on how to do something. And so here we're providing that recipe, the steps, and the very specific instructions on performing a specific task. So based on that, I'll just leave it up there just for a couple more seconds so that you can see the differences between them. So references, just to recap, reference, because I'm going to test you on this right now. References state something that the reader needs to know. Principle, that's your rules. So advises the reader about what they need to do and not do and when. Concept, that's your learning. So when you think concept, ask yourself, would I find it in a dictionary or a glossary? That's usually a really good indicator that it's concept information. Process, again, it's those how things work, what happens within a system. And task is the instructions. So based on all of that, let's see how you feel about giving this a go. And here are some examples. So if the goal of the information is to list the nutritional facts for cherry cola, ask yourself what information type that would be. And then I'll show you the answer. Okay, so if I'm simply listing those nutritional facts, it would be reference information. If I want to explain what a soft drink is, so I'd look at the purpose of this. Purpose obviously is to explain. What's the intended user response of this? Well, the intended user response is for the user to understand, to really know what a soft drink is. Okay, so that's a much different level. So that'd be concept. See how that works? If I want to warn you not to drop a Mentos in your cola bottle, I'd say why not? Because it's fun, but it's a guideline. It's that warning. It's principal information. If I want to illustrate how cola's bottled, when I think about how it's bottled, it's like how it works, how that thing happens, and so it's describing the overall process. If I want to instruct you onto how to safely open your can of cola, then that would be a series of instructions, which of course is a task. If I want to advise you on the best practices for recycling cans, since I'm advising you, I'm trying to guide or require your behavior. And since it's best practices, chances I'd say, yeah, I'm guiding your behavior. Either way, it's still principal information. If I want to tell you or tell the customer this week's sale price for cola, so cola, $2.99, $1.99. I don't know what's a decent price for cola, but that would be reference. I guess it depends how much. And finally, if I want to show you how you can turn your cola can into a nifty craft project with the emphasis, of course, on the word nifty, then again, these are steps. And so we're looking at, again, looking at a task. So have a look, see how you did on those. Did you get most of those right? If so, kudos, well done. If not, then it's like I say, it's a different way of looking at information, particularly if you're not used to information typing like that. So let's see some of this in action. And when we see it in action, we can see that this particular topic, we saw this earlier. And so I just wanted to highlight that we've now applied different information types to them. And so that we can see there's our concept, and we can see that, so that's that general understanding. That would be our definition of chunking. Purpose of chunking is some reference. If we look at the chunking rule, well, the hand's a bit of a dead giveaway, but the chunking rule and the fact that it's a rule says that it's principle. And chunking limits, again, we're guiding that behavior. And so again, more principle information. So we can see in this one topic, and if you remember just a few minutes ago, I showed you that one, it was just one paragraph of information, had 3 different information types in it. You'd have no way of knowing that until you parsed it out. And so that's a really important point, because what that enables us to do is then write the information in an appropriate way. And you can see down at the bottom in the chunking limits, in the chunking limits, we can see that we have 2 parts underneath the chunking limit. And we're going to have a look at that in just a second. So let's have a look at structure. So when we look at structure, what are we talking about? We're talking about predictable patterns and language. Okay, why does it need to be predictable? Well, if it's not predictable, it's going to take me longer to find something that's going to be harder to use. If it's predictable, as a user, every time I see that certain structure, I know what it means. I know how to interpret it. I know how to use that information. And so structure becomes a really important part of the conversation. So these are all the different writing structures that we use at Precision Content, with the exception of paragraph. I didn't put paragraph on the list. That's our base level. So yes, any one of these information types could use a paragraph. But otherwise, these are all the ones that are specific to those information types. And so many you'll recognize. Some and these are often things that you would use yourselves. Things that are different, maybe the inline list, the item description list, counterexample. So there, contrast table. All of these are things that that have come into play as we've evolved the standard. I'm not going to be able to show you examples of all of those, obviously, but I can certainly show you a few. So we've seen in this topic down at the bottom the chunking limits, and we know that that's principal information. Okay, so what's going to be the appropriate structure for that information? If that were just in a paragraph, we'd have to parse those pieces out. Oh, there we go. And so we're looking at what we call the principal statement. And so the principal statement is that core piece of the principle. Okay, so we look at, and it consists of a principal article with 2 or more sub-articles. Okay, and so here are, when we look at chunking limits, the principal article, let's just put the arrows on, there we go. You see the principal article is limit the number of items in a chunk to between 5 and 9. So we know our limit, our maximum is 5 to 9 pieces. And then there are some sub-articles. So the sub-article is that kind of sub-rule, if you want to think about it like that. And so that sub-rule says avoid breaking content into more than 9 items. Okay, kind of already says that in the first thing, but this just spells it out that little bit more to make it clearer. And this is particularly useful when somebody's new to it. If I just left that previous statement and you've been chunking for years, you go, yeah, okay, got it. Whereas somebody else may need a little bit more information. Similarly, there's a second sub-article. When you have more than 9 items, create another chunk. And so by spelling that out again for that newer user, it might be necessary. For an existing user, that might be something where there's I'm already pretty comfortable with that, so no big deal. Now that's the structure of it, but I also want to talk about the structure of the writing, because we have a ton of writing rules around each particular structure. And so for every structure, we have a series of writing rules. So let's have a look at the writing rules for writing principal content. So first thing, we break it out into the parts, as I mentioned. So we've got that main rule and then the supporting rules. So one of the things you'll notice about those main rules and supporting rules is they are a subset. So the supporting rules are a subset of the main rule. They don't just introduce a brand new rule. Okay, they add clarity to that main rule. There could be more supporting rules, so the sub-articles as needed, and we could have them up to the chunking limit, which of course, as you can see from the top line, is up to 9 items. So we could have potentially 9 supporting rules. You'll notice that each of them follows the exact same rule in that they're written as complete standalone sentences. And so that's absolutely key when it comes to using and reusing content. We don't reuse the principal article without the sub-articles as a matter of company policy, for the simple reason we want to make sure that everything's in there. But what it could allow us to do is to show only that principal article and then click to get the sub-article. So it gives us more publication opportunities. And from a micro-content perspective, it's all about having that flexibility and having that pre-thinking about what you're going to be able to do with the content. Another thing about principal information, we write it in second person active voice present tense. We write it in the imperative. Do this. Okay, limit the number of items, avoid breaking content into. When you have more than that, create another chunk. And so we write it as in the imperative mood. And the reason for that is, if I were to say, taking ID badges, for example, wearing ID badges, all employees must wear ID badges. Okay, by putting it in the third person, I've actually created reference content, because I could use that in a manual for somebody to know about some of the things that employees need to do. But because it doesn't necessarily apply to that person, it's not a principle for that person. It's not a rule for them to follow. It's only a rule for the employees to follow. So if I want to write it like as a rule, say you must, wear your ID badge. I wouldn't necessarily write you must, but I'd say wear your ID badge at all times while in the office, or something like that. And you probably just felt that more personally than you did when I said all employees must. All employees must. Yeah, okay, that's nice. You must is like, or do this is kind of a, oh, you mean me? Okay, got it. And so we absorb it differently. And so these writing rules are very important in terms of being very, as you can see, very audience specific. Another thing that we do with principal is we have a standard title structure. So we have a couple of components. We ask, what is it about? And it's about chunking. So what's the rule? And then what's the degree, the gravity? We call it the principal gravity. What's the importance of this? So for example, if PPE is an appropriate one, PPE guideline as against PPE requirements. as against PPE warnings. So thinking about that appropriate level of gravity. And so that will then drive how we write the content. If there's something that's really important, we tend to use positive language wherever possible, but if there's something that's really important that they don't do, don't stick your fingers in the drum or you're going to lose them. That's something we would really spell out, and we'd spell it out in the way that we write that content, as well as the way that we title that content. And so the two must match. We need to make sure there's a finger point pinch danger or something like that, or warning, as against a finger point guideline. And so we use existing wording wherever we can. So for things like danger, warning, caution, where standards exist, but where no standards exist, we create them. And the reason we create them is to make sure that they're used consistently across projects, and particularly obviously when we're working with a client, we want to make sure that everybody's using specific words, specific phraseology in the same way, so that we're taking the writer interpretation out of it as much as possible. And again, from a micro-content perspective, that's critical because it enables the user every time they see a piece of content, they intuitively understand exactly how important or not that is. So that's a principal information. Further in the, I mentioned that we don't write these in a vacuum. We have a standard structure for a principal topic. So when we're actually writing a principal topic, we can see we've got all these different parts, and there's the principal statement, which we've just seen, and so that's the principle itself. There's applicability, and applicability would describe the conditions under which that principle applies. So it might be who it applies to, when it applies, where it applies, and so on. The outcome. So that's, well, what if I kind of mess up, what's the consequence? Oops, sorry, jumping ahead there. What's the consequence? So that's outcome. If we look at resolution, okay, I messed up. How do I resolve it? What do I have to do to fix this problem? And so when we look at resolution, that's again one of these standard blocks we have within a principal topic. And finally, we might add any other miscellaneous topics and support blocks. So one that we've just added as a standard as well is rationale. And all of these, so other than the principal statement, which is mandatory, applicability, outcome, resolution, rationale, and other miscellaneous support blocks are all optional. But what they do is they enable us to create a principal topic structure that's the same every time. And so just so we've gone from micro content back to thinking of micro content within the context of a topic. And so it allows me each and every time to see that standard. So let's have a look at So similarly, we have a structure for a process topic. So this time I'm going to look at it backwards. So we looked at some content, and then we looked at the structure of it. This time we're going to look at the structure of it from kind of top down, and then get to an application. Okay, so first of all, we have the process introduction block, and that is an overview of the process. So quite often we'll do some kind of process description block that says, these three parties are involved in performing this particular, whatever the final outcome is. And it may take a series, and we may put in a time frame, things like that. So it gives an overview of that process. Context, if there's anything else that's relevant to the process, so perhaps the point at which that comes into play. The stages, and this whole stages block, that's the core content of the process. The result, so that would be an outcome if it's not already expected from the title, and then an example, which may be a demonstration of the process. And the result and example we use quite sparingly. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at that stages block. Remember, I said that's the core content of process. Great, so we have a stem sentence to introduce the content. We have that stage description. This is the actual stages themselves. And then stage info, and stage result. So there might be some additional information about the stages, and that's where we can get into branching as well. So when we look at stage description, that's further divided into the detail of each stage, as well as that stage info, stage result. And the stage detail is structured as an optional time frame, and then actor and actions. And so you'll see that each piece is, we get down to fairly granular level of writing. Excuse me. So let's have a look at this example. We've got a very short process here called recruiting new employees. Let's have a look at some of these parts and some of the rules around it. So with process, we write it in third person, active voice, present tense. He does this, she does that, they do the other. We have a standard title structure, and it's so that standard is for process, writing process content. So in this case, we have the gerund of the verb and the plural of the noun. It says that standard title structure. You'll notice obviously it's different from principal because it's different information type, and so has a different purpose, different intended user response. So the intended user response, if we look at process, the purpose of process is to illustrate how things work, or how the pieces fit together, how essentially how actors perform the work, if you want to think of it like that. And the intended user response is for me as a user. I may have a couple of potential responses. So one might just be to get an overview of how things happen, or another may be to understand my role in that particular process. But it's written, or where I fit into that process, and I may fit in 3 or 4 times throughout that process. So it gives me that overview to know where I am and what the consequences are. So there's a whole series of things that I can learn from that process. What the consequences are if I don't do something correctly, for example. Stem sentence to introduce the stages. So we use stem sentences throughout our content. Whenever we have a list, whenever we have a table, whenever we have a visual, we always use a stem sentence. And the reason for that is it orients the user to the content. And you may argue, well, yeah, but we kind of know that because it's under something called recruiting new employees. Sure, it's fairly clear in this case. The challenge is sometimes it's not so clear what a list is about. And so if we don't have the stem sentence, then it reduces clarity for the user. And so for the rule of, remember that fundamental rule of consistency, it ensures that if we do it every time it's there, it takes the question out of it. And it's then 100% clear how I'm meant to use this information. Okay, so that's the stem sentence. These are the stages. And you can see that a couple of the stages have that optional time frame block. So within 2 business days of receiving an application, there's a time frame. 1 week after all interviews are conducted, there's a time frame. If we had a less prescriptive type of time frame, so it's more of a guideline, usually this takes 2 hours, that would appear in the stage info section. We don't have any stage info in this particular process, but were we to have some, that's where it would go. And we have the actors and the actions. So we've got the time frame, actor, actions set up each time. Okay, so that's our structure for process. So now I want to just close by getting you to think about this. When we put it all together, so when we're transforming content, as I've mentioned, we talk about the having the content, so it's broken out into a specific part. So we have the focus, we have the function, we have the structure. So then we write that content, we break it out based on its information type and its subject matter, and then we write it in the best way that we can, and the most appropriate way for the user. And of course, As I mentioned, we're writing in topics, and so we're putting that that context around it. We can apply that metadata so that we know who the audience is for this content. We know the use of it and everything else, so that we can take each of these little pieces and use them effectively as micro content. So when we put it all together, we take content that looks like this, and this is actually not bad because they already started using bullets. Fantastic. I've already got an unordered list. Oops, sorry, I just lost my, actually I don't need that. There we go, let's go there. And we take it from that to this. And so when we have, when we see this content, you can see that we've got more titles, we've got more white space, we've got a table in the middle here. We've got a couple of what we call sub-blocks. So we've broken content out into, they all fit within advantages and disadvantages, and we've broken it out into these sub-blocks. And what that allows us to do is if we ask that question, what frequency sources do most time-based timing and synchronization devices use? It's gonna take a little bit for you to wade through that and find it, okay? Just to take the pressure off, you'll see it's there. But you wouldn't know it's there unless you read it. So you have to read a lot of content to realize that you didn't need to read that content. And that's a lot of what we take out of it when we're writing. And that's what we need to do when we're creating micro content. We need to take out the guesswork. If we were to do a search and search the word synchronize, we go, oh, that's a synchronization, and we might look at synchronization, and then we see synchronization here, and then we see it here, and then we'll see it again here, and then throughout the content we see it again here. We'd probably find it 15 times before we get to the right place. Devices might be a better word, but I wouldn't know to search for devices until I tried synchronization and go, ooh, that's not going to work. And so it's making sure that we've got content that is usable not just by humans but by machines. So now if we look at a different question, what are the advantages of time-based synchronization? It's I'm guessing you've probably already found it, and down at the bottom here. And the reason it's so much easier to find is because we've got this series of road signs, if you want to think of them like that, pointing in the right direction. And by being able to point us in the right direction, we can go in, see, is that what we needed? Yes, it is. No, if it's not, then frankly, I haven't done my job. But if that's in the wrong, if there are more advantages, then we'd have to further define those titles. So we'd have the advantages and disadvantages of time-based synchronization, and then we might have advantages and disadvantages of time-based synchronization devices or something like that. There might be different different title for that different content. All in all, what that's going to allow us to do is to use those, by applying those 4 principles of micro content, it's going to enable us to create content that, yes, we can use as micro content, but also fits in within that larger scheme of different documentation, different content, different content bodies. So I just see a question. Would you consider a troubleshooting topic to be a principal topic or a task topic, or does it depend on the context? Great question. With a troubleshooting topic, I think it would depend on the context, and it may end up, I would expect it's more likely to be a task if it's something that I'm able to do myself. If it's something that that I need to get somebody else to do, it might be a case of, do not open the device and send in. So thank you for your question there, Rebecca. Again, context would come in, and thinking about who that troubleshooting is for, because now I might do troubleshooting for the tech. And the tech is going to have a different level of troubleshooting ability than the customer. And so thinking about those those kind of questions. So again, you're right, it would come back to context. If I'm a tech in a store and I'm not quite sure what I need to do with this particular thing, I look it up, boom, find that particular piece of information. Okay, that's for me as this particular type of user. So thank you for that. Is methodology based on information mapping? They seem very similar. We're definitely heavily influenced by information mapping. What we've done, and the biggest difference is, we've defined a lot of the writing around each of these information types with a lot more clarity. But also, we've tied it to the ability to create this content in data XML. So we have our own specializations of data. We call PC data. And we have versions in Oxygen and in Easy Data. And so we have those 5 topic types. We're able to slot the pieces that we have into those very, very specific elements that I showed you earlier. So yes, there are similarities. There are also some pretty major differences, and I think you'll find similarities with other methodologies as well. We're all aiming for the end goal, so it's highly likely there's going to be a lot of similarity. So we're into the questions part, folks. I noticed there's another one. No, actually I answered that one, I think. Unless there's another question that I'm missing.
Nope, I think you got them all. You did my job for me.
Whew.
Yeah, no. So if you do have questions, let's try to get them into the questions dialogue. Or if you have comments, you can put them in the chat on there. So you said you do these specializations. How would, if somebody wanted to go about using those specializations, are they public domain, or do you license them, or how does that work?
That's a great question. So yeah, we license those. They're certainly not public domain at this point. If we get big enough, who knows? So yeah, they come in, and usually we license for companies. So we have several companies who use the Easy Data version. And if you're not familiar with the Easy Data, it's a really great tool that takes out a lot of the more complex elements. Of course, you lose certain elements of flexibility, but for a more moderate-sized organization, when it's all they need, it's perfect. It's a great tool, very easy to use. And the other version is Oxygen. So we use Oxygen for certainly our more sophisticated clients. We have some pretty large clients we're working with at the moment who are using the Oxygen version.
Okay. And then there's a question about, how does microcontent play in a knowledge base?
That's a good question. So when you say play, I'm not quite sure what you mean there.
All right, maybe Jim, you could elaborate on that. In the meantime, here's he says, what are compelling use cases in a knowledge base?
Okay. In a knowledge base, so we would be creating the content overall. For microcontent within a knowledge base, it's more, are you getting the answer to your specific question? And so by targeting the answer, and I'm not sure if I'm answering your question fully here, Tim, but by targeting that information, writing it in a way that is going to be useful to the end users, and making sure that the content is specific enough to answer that single question. That's if I'm answering your question correctly, or if I'm understanding your question correctly, that's how we'd use it in a knowledge base, to make sure that we're getting into that very specific content. I hope that answered it.
Okay.
And if not, if it's more detailed than that, I'm going to punt you to somebody else.
Yeah, and he does say, yes, you're answering it. And so good job.
Right on. Thank you.
There's a question about, can you adapt this without using DITA, say in Madcap Flare?
Yeah, absolutely. So while we obviously wouldn't have a specialization in terms of the tool, we do have clients who use only regular DITA, for example, so they're just using the out-of-the-box Oxygen. It's more about how you identify that content. So you could use different metadata to identify, hey, although we're using a concept topic type through metadata, we're identifying this as principal, for example. And so if this is principal information, it just becomes a little more onerous on the writers to remember the rules and to apply the rules consistently. Whereas with the when you're using the kind of the PC DITA version, it's you're very limited in what you can do in each element. So it kind of puts the rules in front of you, and it's a very constrained environment, which as a writer, if you wanted to do more you're writing for emotion type writing, then it's very constraining and very painful. But writing for information and as a technical writer, so that writing for logic, it's wonderful because it takes a lot of the decision making out of the actual writing piece, because I know I have these rules. I can only fit certain things into certain boxes, if you like. And so based on that, the writing itself becomes much, much easier. So to circle back to the original question, can you use it outside? Absolutely. We use the exact same structures just within Word, for example. So you don't need a tool to be able to write effectively. It just enables you to do more things based on the tool that you have.
Right. And that's a little bit related to Mike's question about, and he apologized because he came in late. But what's the best way to manage these information chunks? Is it in some kind of database, a CCM or a CCMS or a CMS? What's your advice there?
I'm not the expert on this, but CCMS is where we go. It enables us to put so much more rich metadata around things, and to be able to create a world of maps and bookmaps. But I'm not the guy who does that stuff, so I'm going to pass that. If you want more information on that, please reach out to me and I can pass you on to the appropriate person, Mike.
Okay, great. All right, and John has a stumper for you, I guess.
We've just had one.
Which is correct? The phrase, you set two clocks identically, or the phrase, two clocks are set identically?
Okay, we would, it depends on that context. So what's the purpose and what's the intended user response? So if we're looking at it from a guidance perspective, if we're trying to guide somebody, or specifically if we're trying to give them instructions, we would just say set two clocks identically. If we are looking more in that sort of theoretical, we're trying to give that theoretical example, we'd write it more in the third person. I'm not a huge fan of using the passive voice, but in this particular case, it could work. Two clocks are set identically because it doesn't matter who did it, and so it takes that element out of it. So if I'm just trying to set the scenario, then that third person, even in the passive voice, could be appropriate. So we write in the active voice as a rule. There has to be a strong reason to have an exception to that rule, and one of those reasons is where the person who performs that particular task doesn't matter. Okay, so you could say penicillin was discovered if the context, if it doesn't matter who discovered it.
Okay, we got a thanks. There were some other good kudos in there. Are there more questions for Mike? Normally when we think we're about to wrap up, 3 or 4 more questions come in, but right now it looks like we've answered all of the questions.
Okay, excellent.
Because I think we did, Jim was asking about, or James was asking about, would you break up the topic? And that was related to his knowledge base discussion. And
right.
I think you answered that, didn't you?
I think so. So
Yeah.
the way that we actually write, we write as topics and then we reuse the content elsewhere. So if we needed it elsewhere, we'd always have it in that context of the topic because that's how it was originally intended. If we had a totally different use for that information. So for example, if we think about making tea, can't get more English than that, right? So if we think about making tea, to make tea, do this, 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 written as a task. Maybe maybe somebody else doesn't need to actually make the tea, they just need to know kind of what's involved. And so that particular information wouldn't be the right information for them because it has a different purpose, has a different intended user response. And so we'd actually write a sister topic to it, if you like, if you want to think of it like that, where it'd write in third person, to make tea, somebody does A, B, and C. And the reason is because it has that different purpose, different intended user response, but it may well still fit in with the overall kind of making tea topic. And so in the knowledge base, you could reuse that content if you needed, if that piece was missing, we'd write it but add it to a specific topic, which is one of my the challenges with things like FAQs, because now all of a sudden you lose any context around that question. My big argument is it really frequently asked, or did just somebody once ask it somewhere? And so the challenge with FAQs is they're out of context. And so making sure they fit into a topic somewhere then enables you to make sense of that information in a much, much easier way. It's harder to write in the first place because you've got to find the appropriate place to fit it. But I'm just saying, oh, yeah, just answer the question. But then it does enable you to afterwards find that content more easily, update it when you need to, etc.
Okay. So he's asking another follow-up question
Sure,
here
this is
again.
great.
Yeah. What are the implications of using the bricks on their own, where the bricks are micro content, and then recombining the bricks, so to speak?
Okay, so it all comes down to that reuse strategy and having a reuse strategy in the first place. So if you're breaking it out, so again, it still lives within the topic, so the original topic. We don't break down any further than a block. So the block is the lowest level we'll go to, simply because then we miss context. So for example, we don't tend to reuse single list items. Just because they're often put into a context, and so taking them out of context can be tricky. But it's having that solid reuse strategy. Some of the challenges is, like I mentioned before, making sure that it's fitting. So if we're recombining it elsewhere, have we just made a square peg fit into a round hole? Or are we trying to do that? So again, it's thinking back to that purpose, that intended user response of that content, and so making sure we've got the correct information type, and making sure that we've got the appropriate, we're fulfilling the objective of that particular piece of information. It has a function. Are we fulfilling that function? So that would be one of the downfalls. Certainly something to look at when you're reusing content.
Great. And we got a kudos on that. Thanks. So nicely
You're welcome.
answered. That was their comment, but I agree. All right. Anything else
Thank you.
for Mike this time? And Mike, are you normally when we have webinar speakers, if they're going to be speaking at a conference or something, we do a shout out for that? Are you speaking any place you want to let the audience know about?
Yeah, actually, we're going to be at the at Omnichannel, excuse me, Omnichannel X, doing a 3-hour workshop on June 8th. So if you're not able to make the entire Omnichannel X conference, then you can attend our half-day workshop. Alternatively, we've got a new e-learning program. And so if you're really keen on learning a bit more about this, get in touch with us. Because we have a discount code for you as well. So just let us know you're at the CIDM webinar today, and we'll happily give you a discount on that. And finally, if you've got further questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I don't know if my email's there, Kathy.
Oh, it is. It's on the screen right now. And
Okay, you
then-
can still see the screen.
Yep,
Wasn't
and
sure if you could
when-
still see the screen.
And when we send the follow-up for that the recording is available, Lavanya will include your email there as well.
Perfect. Yeah.
And this is
feel
so
free to-
weird. I didn't know you had that slide that you.
Yeah, I just put it up with the questions when I'm like, oh, might as well
Yeah.
just put this one up now.
Yeah, no, I didn't even know, and I cued you for
I
it.
know. That's
Thinking alike there
awesome.
today.
Thank you. It's a
Yeah. Very strange. All right, with that, I do want to remind everybody, we are did record this, and we will get you the link here very soon with that link.
Oops.
And stay informed. And yes, John,
one thing, sorry, John. Yes, you're 100% right. It should be Omni, not Omin. That was what happens when I type it in a hurry. I'm sorry about that. It should be Omni.
Omni. That's right. And that's the one that's in international hours. I mean, European hours, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So it's over there.
But the I believe the half-day workshop is, I think it's Eastern time, 9 a.m.
So it's in the
That'd be
afternoon. So
7
it's early
a.m.
for it. Yeah.
7 a.m. Mountain.
Yes. Yep. Okay, great. All
So
right.
if you fancy an early morning and a bit of fun, we'll get into this in a lot more detail.
All right. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. And thank you, Mike, for presenting. We appreciate it.
You're so
Have a
welcome.
great
Thank
day,
you very much
everybody.
for having me. Do appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.